We're going to shift now from looking at the sort of the inner experience of immigrant communities to looking at the national landscape, politics and economics of immigration reform. As I said this morning, we are, not by design, but in reality, meeting at a critical moment, a highly polarized and charged moment of debate. And we are really lucky here to have a couple of colleagues who can lead us through this landscape and the kinds of issues that probably are being neglected and should underlie a lot of the coverage. I live in two villages. One of them is the village of Columbia Journalism School, which is a big university, but the journalism school is a small place. And the other is the city of New Haven, Connecticut, which is also like a little village. And these are two friends from each of those villages, which appropriately enough for an immigration discussion. Ed Schumacher-Matos is my colleague at Columbia. He's the James Madison visiting professor at Columbia Journalism School and also the ombuds for National Public Radio, which is sort of the day job, I guess, and someone who stands for the highest practice standards in journalism in that way. Kica Matos is an attorney, an activist, and the director of immigrant rights and racial justice for the Center for Community Change. Both of them have, for all kinds of reasons, been looking at immigrant community issues for a very long time. And we couldn't do better, I think, at this moment. Kica's going to give us an overview of the immigration reform landscape, her own work, the debates that are playing out now, the challenges to comprehensive immigration reform. And Ed will talk about economic trends and research concerning immigration, its implications for reporters, and related issues. I want to start with Kica, I think, because you, given everything that's going on, it would probably be useful to have you frame the issues as you see them. Then we'll go to Ed, and then we'll have a conversation. And Ed has a 12:30 train, and I pledged to get him out in time. So.
Thanks, Bruce. And for those of you who are curious, you should know that Ed and I are neither married nor family.
So far as we know.
Yes, as far as I know. So a little bit about CCC. I work at an organization based in DC called the Center for Community Change, which was started by staffers of Robert Kennedy after he died to keep his legacy and his vision alive. So it's been around for 45 years, and what it does is it really works to empower low-income communities and communities of color around the country through a number of different ways, including community organizing, and CCC also serves as the bridge on many occasions between communities and the Beltway. We work in a number of different areas: economic justice, we have a housing trust fund, we do civic engagement work, we do retirement security, so we've been very active in trying to protect the demise of Social Security. And I think probably the area where we are most well known for is immigration reform. We've been at it for over a decade, and we were probably one of the first national organizations who really took on the plight of advancing and calling for comprehensive immigration reform for undocumented immigrants during a time when undocumented immigrants were largely silent and hidden. I want to just quickly present a snapshot of where we are on the immigration reform front, but before I do that, I want to just throw out some stats and facts and figures about the immigrant population in the US, both documented and undocumented. So now, and if this is redundant, I apologize, and just raise your hand and I'll stop. As of 2011, there were 40.4 million foreign-born people in the US. This population has more than doubled since the 1960s, and immigrants are now 13% of the population, and by way of comparison, 5% of the total population in 1960 was foreign-born. 2 in 3 immigrants living in the U.S. got here before 2000, so we have immigrants who've been living here well over a decade. Today's immigrants are also more diverse, and again, by point of comparison, in 1960, 75% of the foreign-born population living here came from Europe. Today, that percentage has dropped to 12, and that largely has to do with Senator Kennedy's attempts to change the visa system. Immigrants today are settling all over the U.S. 2/3 of states had immigrant populations in 2010 that were above 5%. A little bit about the undocumented population, because that is really at the crux of the debate that's taking place right now in the country, and it is a raging, very heated debate. There are 11 million people living in the U.S. Who don't have status, they're undocumented. The majority of them are from Mexico. 6.8 million, or 59% of the undocumented population, is originally from Mexico. They've also been here for quite a long time. So about 63% of undocumented immigrants have been living in the U.S. for at least 10 years. And many undocumented immigrants are part of what are known as mixed status families, which are families where some members are U.S. citizens and some are undocumented. 16.6 million people in this country are of mixed status families. And millions of U.S. citizen children have undocumented parents. Approximately 4.5 million U.S.-born kids have at least one parent who does not have status. So where are we on the immigration reform front? Like I said earlier, it is raging, it is heated, it is taking up a lot of attention and energy both in DC and around the country. In June, as some of you probably know, the Senate, and it's a debate that's been going on for a long time. There were hopes in 2006 and 2007 that a bill was going to pass, and it didn't. And I think this is the latest iteration of immigration reform legislative efforts where we feel like we're actually making headway. The last time there was any significant legislative effort that was successful was in 1986. So in essence, since 1986, we have had a system that has, for many respects, been broken, and is part of the reason why we have so many people in this country without status. So in June of this year, a Senate bill passed. It was called S-744, and it had bipartisan support. It passed by a vote of 68 to 32. And it was crafted by a group called the Gang of Eight, 4 Democratic and 4 Republican senators, in a real effort to create a bill that was reflective of the needs and desires of both parties. It offered, so on the Democratic side, the Democrats really wanted to make sure that there was a path to citizenship in the bill. So the bill has a path to citizenship. It's a 13-year path, but it's a path nonetheless. And the Republicans really wanted to bolster more border security. And so the bill requires 700 additional miles of fencing, 38,000 new Border Patrol agents, amongst other things like drones and so on and so forth. And since then, the focus has really been on the House to get moving. And there was a bill that was introduced about 6 weeks ago called H.R. 15, and this really was an effort on the part of Democrats to try to get some motion. And it has now 192 co-sponsors, but only 3 of them are Republicans. And I would say there are 3 major challenges in the efforts to pass immigration reform legislation. First is a real lack of political will on the part of some Republicans, especially Tea Party Republicans, who are afraid that they will lose out in their primaries and they will be voted out of office if they support immigration reform. The second is a real lack of leadership on the part of Obama. I mean, some people say that politically, he has taken quite a few hits recently, and his ability to move immigration reform forward is extremely limited. But I don't see the same passion and efforts that he lent to, for example, the healthcare reform, to immigration. He says the right things, but I don't see the organizing efforts that took place in the White House on other issues on the reform issue. And the third is, and this is no news to anybody in this room, Congress is hopelessly gridlocked. And so while they're busy playing silly politics, right, we have an issue that is serious, we have a crisis, and not a whole lot is happening. Passage in the House depends on Speaker Boehner, and Speaker Boehner, on the one hand, says that he favors immigration reform in principle and keeps saying we're going to move on this, we're going to move on this. But on the other hand, he's the person who's really standing in the way of reform. If we were to call for a vote on immigration reform legislation tomorrow, a bill would pass, right? But he is doing everything he can to sit on this issue and not move it forward. The latest mutterings from him is he has flatly rejected negotiating or taking the Senate bill to conference, and in essence has said, we will do this, but we're going to do it step by step. What does this sound like? It sounds like the civil rights debate when you had a bunch of Southern legislators saying, we need to move on civil rights slowly because our communities aren't ready. And that's in essence what Boehner is saying. We're going to move piecemeal, right? And we're going to take care of the issues that matter to us. So E-Verify, making sure that there's a system in place to check everybody's status, to make sure that they're legally able to work, and a lot of border security. There have been 5 bills that have passed in the House on immigration, and all of them deal with border security. Big concern of Republicans, and I think part of the reason also why there's not been a whole lot of movement is this debate that will grow over time, and it's starting to pick up steam, and that's the debate over whether the 11 million people should be put on a path to citizenship or whether they should simply be legalized. I have gone publicly out on a limb and called this a modern system of apartheid because in essence, if the Republicans have their way, there will be immigration reform that will grant the 11 million or maybe a majority of them, maybe not dreamers, and a few categories that will be dealt with separately, but the 11 million status will change, so they'll be able to live in this country, they'll be able to work in this country, they'll probably be able to travel in this country, but they will never, ever get a path to citizenship. So we're looking at, if this goes forward, millions of people, many of them whom are brown people, who will never be able to vote, and they would never be citizens in this country. There is the other thing I would say is the Republicans are, and there's this raging debate within the Republican leadership and the Republican Party about immigration reform and how to move forward. So you have some of the leadership saying, this is the Latino and immigrant population is growing, right? Immigrants and Latinos spoke very loudly in the last elections, right? 71% of Latinos voted for Obama, right? There is a fear that with this growing population, right, eventually they'll have so much political power and will wield so much political power that Republicans will become increasingly irrelevant. And the head of the Republican National Committee wrote that in a report and said, we have to get right with Latinos, we have to get right with immigrants. So there are those who are holding the moral, well, some are holding the moral high ground. Most are holding this political reality in check and saying we have to get this done because it will matter to our party. There's the Tea Partiers who are adamantly opposed because they don't want to lose. And then there are people somewhere in the middle. And I think that part of the anxiety, again, is somewhat political. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? How are we going to move? And there's been no sense of leadership on the part of the Republicans about just which way they're going to go. So you will hear very different statements from different people in the Republican Party. And our sense is that they're floating trial balloons to see which way politically they will eventually go. I know I have a couple of minutes, so I'm going to chop here. What I would say about this issue is that this issue is not going to go away, and it's not going to go away for a couple of reasons. One is this is really, to me, one of the biggest civil rights issues of this nation, and one that we have to grapple with. And the immigration reform efforts are really led by a movement that is growing. And interestingly, it's a movement where you see really aggressive efforts on the right and the left and the middle, right? So you have immigrant advocates who are very progressive organizations, Amnesty International, the ACLU, the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights. And then you have efforts on the right, which are led by an organization called the National Immigration Forum. They launched a campaign called Bibles, Badges, and Business. And they have done a really good job of mobilizing our friends on the right, including evangelicals, chiefs of police, business leaders, to advocate for immigration reform. We have Bloomberg's organization, Partnership for a New American Economy. And then you have, what's his name, the Facebook guys, Zuckerberg, thank you, who started another organization called Forward.us, whose purpose is primarily to advocate on immigration reform. In the meantime, while we're stuck on this political logjam around immigration reform, deportations continue to happen all over the country. On average, 1,100 people are deported every day. Obama has, by the end of Obama's first term, he had deported more people than Bush had during his entire 8 years in office. And I just want to throw out a statistic. In 2011, 392,000 immigrants were removed from the US. In other words, they were deported. Less than half of those were deported for breaking US laws. In 2012, 409,849 immigrants had been deported. By the end of this year, we will likely reach 2 million of the number of people deported under the Obama administration. Lastly, just a quick snapshot of where immigration reform is in the states. A lot of movement in 43 states and the District of Columbia. 146 laws and 231 resolutions were passed relating to undocumented and illegal immigrants, migrants, and refugees. 23% of them were either dealing with driver's licenses or providing identification cards for immigrants. 25 states, for example, considered allowing undocumented immigrants to have driver's licenses. 10 of those states passed. In Republican-controlled legislatures, a lot of the legislature dealt with enforcement. In democratically controlled legislatures, we were really looking at immigration integration of efforts writ large. And there were some efforts in some states to really squeeze immigrants and really narrow their ability to be integrated. So in Alabama, for example, a law recently passed where physicians and physicians' assistants were required to prove that they're US citizens in order to retain their license to practice. So it's those efforts. I'm going to close really quickly, and Bruce, I know I'm a little bit over time, with a question that Kate posed, which is, what is it that reporters seem to get right or wrong when covering immigration? What you see as unrepresented stories, and anything else you'd like to impart? And I want to say that the answer really comes from our communications team at the Center for Community Change. And these set of answers I lifted mostly from a woman Donna de la Cruz, who was a longtime reporter from the Associated Press. So I am channeling Donna here. I think I'm starting to sound a little defensive, but this is what Donna said about coverage of immigration. She said, and I'm quoting, "Reporters seem eager to give ink or airtime to people like Steve King." He's the very right-wing, anti-immigrant member of Congress from Iowa, while ignoring the voices of the people who are impacted by the immigration system. Her second critique is reporters often do stories off of news releases and never get out into the field. And she puts in brackets, "I know many of them have numerous beats they're covering, so getting out of the office is difficult." Reporters do a lot of packed journalism and don't seem to want to be the ones to break the mold and write something new. And she said, "And I think my one big issue is the reporters don't seem to think immigration is ever going to pass, so they don't want to waste too much time on it." Don't give up. Please don't give up.
Excellent.
I'm done.
All right.
I'm just going to say, in my wallet, I carry this little piece of plastic. This is an Elm City resident card. The city of New Haven was one of the first to establish an identification program for all citizens that would enable otherwise undocumented immigrants to have some status and to have a way of opening bank accounts and dealing with the cops and stuff like that. It's because of this woman that it happened, but it's also an example of the kind of local initiatives that Kica was describing that are often granular and concrete. They're not always big and sweeping. But that's a story worth looking at. Sir, take us into the world of economics and other.
Well, it falls to me to do the heavy-duty, boring stuff about economics and fiscal and economic impact of immigration. Let me start by just throwing out, and I thought that was a wonderful summary of the political situation today and of the overall demographics, which were very good. But there's one thing I'd like to say to start out, but anything that's got to do with economics or about the political stuff, is that the great migration wave is essentially over. That there are, it's topped out 4 or 5 years ago, that the number of undocumented immigrants coming into the country versus the number leaving has been more or less flat now for the last 3 or 4 years. It's for 2 reasons. 1, the economy. 2, enforcement works. And so those 2 things have more or less flattened out the numbers. And that's going to affect the political debate. You already see it. It flattened out in California much earlier than that. And so you see the total tenor of the political debate changing in California. And it's slowly changing across the country, which suddenly you began seeing more and more local laws being pro-immigrant instead of being anti-immigrant, which they were when you had this huge wave of immigrants coming into parts of the country that were not used to them. I mean, every place where immigrants have been new, where there's been a great overwhelming number, there's been a tremendous backlash, natural thing to have happen. The issue is how to manage that kind of a thing, and we see it's beginning to be managed now, in part because of all the work of the advocates, in part because the numbers finally are changing, in part because of just cultural things. You get to know the new people who've come into your community and you discover they're not so bad after all. You discover it's better to work to make them integrate as opposed to reject them. But on top of that, enforcement's also working. I mean, like it or dislike it, and we can talk about that, but you have to have some kind of an immigration system for a country that has some kind of enforcement, and it's working. So it's cruel what's happening right now with the deportations and everything. That's a whole different issue. We can talk about that. I think that there are 2 debates. One debate is what should the future be in terms of immigration, and what do you do with that great core of undocumented immigrants who are here today? And you have to separate those 2 issues in anything you do talking about immigration. So let's look at the fiscal situation then, because everybody tries to claim in this political debate the economic arguments on their side. And there have been a whole series of reports coming out this year making huge claims about it's either they're huge costs or they're a huge benefit. And let me see if I can just throw out conclusions, because there are more numbers than you want to hear, and I won't bore you. We can come back to them if you want to in the questions. One is that there is no doubt that undocumented immigrants cost the country more than in fiscal costs than the country receives in benefits from them. There's no doubt about that. It all happens mostly at the local level, right? At the local level, undocumented immigrants and immigrants in general cost the country in local taxes, cost local communities more in taxes, more in costs than the local communities receive in taxes. And the primary thing that is education. That's what most of our local taxes, our property taxes, go to pay is for education, right? Like in 2005, like 1 out of 5 kids in the local schools, now it's like 1 out of 4 are immigrants. And teaching English proficiency costs more, all these kinds of things, and they're just new kids in the schools. On health care, it also costs some, but much less, in part because immigrants are healthier. They use, with all the stuff that you hear about, they're crowding out the emergency rooms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's some truth to that. There's some truth to that in absolute numbers, though in relative numbers, actually, immigrants use emergency rooms much less than white American citizens do, in part because they're just younger and healthier. At the state level, on the other, that's a local level. At the state level, on the other hand, it's a very different situation. It varies from state to state. Some states, actually, the bottom line is it costs the states more immigrants. In other states, it costs the states actually receive a benefit. Overall, it's more on the side of more states make money off of immigrants in state taxes than they pay in state services. This is especially true of those states that have low, that are not generous states. And mostly states, in the West, Texas, Nebraska, Arkansas, states like that, where they've done these sorts of studies, you discover that the states receive far more than they pay out. The federal level, at the federal level, there's a net fiscal benefit from all immigrants. However, from undocumented immigrants, there is a deficit at the federal level. Social Security receives more. Social Security actually makes money off of undocumented immigrants. Some half to two-thirds of immigrants pay federal taxes. How is that? And how is it they pay into the Social Security fund? Because they have false cards. And so they pay that, they pay into Social Security and they pay into Medicare, and they never get that money back because they're false names. They never get it back. But it's not going to save Social Security, and it's not going to save Medicare. Social Security and Medicare have their own problems in terms of their long-term viability under current funding formulas. You have to understand the funding formulas have always changed for Social Security and Medicare, so it's not the big crisis that oftentimes is made out to be. But under current funding formulas, Social Security, which would already be running greater deficits than it's sort of bumping up against now, if it weren't for undocumented immigrants, will still be having that problem in a couple of years. It's a fool's game to think that immigration and particularly undocumented immigrants are going to save Social Security or save Medicare. They're not. You can't keep importing young people to keep that citizen alive, that system alive. At some point, it has to find its own sustainable balance. Nonetheless, it's true that right now, Social Security and Medicare benefit from undocumented immigrants and all immigrants. So if you put everything together, you put the three together, the balance is on the side of immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, cost the country more fiscally than the country receives and what they pay in taxes. And this is aside from the fact that most immigrants do indeed, including undocumented immigrants, do indeed pay taxes. Most of them do pay. They pay property taxes to their rent. They pay all kinds of federal, state, and local excise taxes through fees and sales taxes, etc. And so many of them, as I say, actually pay income taxes. Right? So you put it all together, but there's one key asterisk that you have to put on these numbers. And it goes back to what I said was it costs at the local level more than local governments receive. That asterisk is how do you rate the expenses on immigrant children who are born in this country? Should you count their costs as an immigrant cost, or do you count their costs as a regular American cost? And do you see that as a cost, or do you see education expenses as an investment in the future? So if you took out those children, I'm talking about American-born children to including undocumented immigrants, all of a sudden the formula the cost looks less, but it's still a cost. But let me say a second asterisk on here, two asterisks if I can say that. All Americans, middle class, and lower income Americans receive more in local services than they pay in taxes. In other words, this is not an immigrant phenomenon. This is an age phenomenon. They're young families, and they cost more than they receive. All Americans. It only stands to reason that it happens with immigrants too, in other words. Does that make sense? So then let's move then from the fiscal side. And let me say historically it's always been that way. If you go back to the last great immigration wave, which was at the turn of the century of the 19th, 20th century, which is almost equal to what we have today, actually slightly more, but more or less the same sort of big blips in immigration. If you go back to, it was the same back then. If you go back and look at what happened in New York and Chicago and the cities, it was the same thing. Immigrants received more in benefits than they paid in taxes. And despite all those wonderful stories about your grandmother coming over to do all that work, a lot of it's malarkey. But let's look then at the economic side. Let's look at what happens on the economic side. Undocumented immigrants compete. Most of them are unskilled. What is the great impact of immigration on jobs and on wages? It really happens at two ends of the scale. It happens at the scale of PhDs, where you have a huge number of PhDs who come in and compete with American PhDs. And it happens at the very bottom at the unskilled labor market. Now, the bottom 10%, and now maybe it's getting down close to the bottom 5%. That the great increase in the number of people coming in has an impact on wages at the top and at the bottom. And you can't deny it. The big fight, there's a huge fight among academics about how big that impact is. But if you look real closely at what they have to say, their differences are almost nothing. They're infinitesimal differences where they're just slicing, slicing it very finely. And the big fight they have is over how long it takes for the economy to adjust so that impact on wages at the bottom 5, 10% or at the top becomes swallowed, becomes overcome, right? And we can go into some of these details if you want. But just think about it for a second. Who are all these poor immigrants competing with? They're competing mostly with African Americans, and they're competing with Hispanics and the previous immigrants who arrived. They're competing with each other. This is particularly true among undocumented immigrants who, unfortunately, so many of them do not have high school degrees. So they're at that unskilled level, right? So you have to think about American social policy. Then it becomes, you have a social policy issue here. And, we can all talk about, okay, how do you resolve this thing? But it is true that all these immigrants coming in, including undocumented immigrants who are unskilled, do indeed make the economy grow, right? Now, they make it grow so that we all benefit. Let me stop 1 second. Before saying that, I told you hit at the top at the bottom. Everybody else in between, including everybody in this room, actually benefits from illegal immigration. Why? Because they keep costs low and they contribute to productivity. But costs low means low wages, right? I mean, everybody wants to say, oh, immigrants, contribute to the economy, and they make the economy grow. Well, they make the economy grow, and they make it grow more per capita only to the extent that they increase productivity. And the increase in productivity comes from either innovation or low wages, so that money goes into capital. This is the flip side that you have to always think of. For every benefit, there's a cost, and there's this cost there that you have to recognize, right? So, if we then take it to the next step, okay. And so the rest of us make money off of that. So then what happens at the productivity level? Let's don't look at the wage level now. What about the productivity level? Among the high-skilled immigrants, there is no doubt that they contribute to productivity increases in the country. A quarter of the Silicon Valley companies, a quarter of the high-tech companies in the last 10, 15 years have been founded by immigrants. Half of all the patents that have been new patents in the country have come from immigrants. You can go on and on and on about the number of Fortune 500 companies that are headed by immigrants. So at that level, there's no doubt what they do for the American economy. What about at the bottom level? Well, in addition to what I said about that, lower wages, the second thing is that they are in fact far more entrepreneurial than native-born Americans, including white Americans. And so you can go look at something called the Kaufman Index put out by the Kaufman Foundation. It sort of measures these things. And immigrants start businesses much more than native-born Americans, including unskilled immigrants. And that little taco stand in the corner actually contributes to American productivity. It actually makes the economy grow. So they bring a tremendous vitality to the country that's very hard to measure. But if you just look at the flat measurements, right? If you look at the flat measurements in a short period of time, right? What you discover is the fiscal impact, the best we can measure it, may be 0.2% of the GDP. The economic benefit, may be 0.1% GDP. These various studies have been done. Those are rounding errors. The truth of the matter is, it's pretty much a wash. No, that nobody has the exact numbers on any of this. And so generally speaking, it's a wash in the short term of what immigrants contribute to the American economy and what they cost us fiscally. Does that make sense? Generally speaking, in the short term. In the long term, it's a totally different story, and this comes from that productivity I talked about. And that's just American history. You just see the growth of the country and everything that the immigrants have done to the country. So the issue from an economic perspective is, where is the balance between the costs and the benefits? You know? And so the numbers, nobody has precise numbers. All this stuff is based on modeling. Not even anyone can tell you exactly what it costs us, or what they pay in taxes, or what they cost in taxes. Believe it or not, you think that'd be an accounting exercise, but nobody really knows. So much are estimates made by a zillion economists. But if you look at all of them and you put it all together, it generally comes out to a wash with the long-term benefit. And where should we be? Well, fortunately, we know we've probably hit the top, like I say, and we're coming back down, so I don't think we're going to be challenging the system to see to what extent that the negative side is going to hurt us more than the positive side. As we come down, the negative side comes down too, and I think you'll see more of the positive benefits and you'll see the negative benefits over the coming years.
All right. Let's go to questions from the room. Anybody have anywhere you want to start? And I guess I'll throw something out to both of you. A lot of folks here are thinking about local coverage and how to localize these big trends. Whether it's the big sweeping economic analysis you're describing, or this logjam in Washington, where we're swinging from hunger strikes to Republicans doing whatever it is Republicans do. That's the political equivalent of a hunger strike, refusing to pass legislation, right? How can we take this kind of national story or elite story or story focused on some fairly narrow power centers and make it local? What are some ways of doing that?
Ed, do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
Well, I'm happy to start. I mean, whatever happens nationally is happening locally. It's just, I think it's very important to, one thing is doing the mental health story. That's a different story. And that's a very real story. What you guys are doing on the mental health side is so like true and right on and everything, all the concerns about that. There's no doubt about that. About looking at the immigrants themselves. Looking at the bigger story of immigration, I think you have to look at two sides. I think you have to look at the immigrant side and what's happening to immigrants, and I think you have to look at the community side. What's happening to the community, right? And that's where you look at the policy issues of the positives and the negatives. And if you're not honest and do both positive and negatives, all you do is alienate one sector or the other. You've got to pull it all together, and if we're going to have a community that's able to talk about these issues and try to resolve them, we have to put it all on the table to understand it. I mean, I don't totally agree that the Tea Party is only driven by its own self-interest. So many psychological studies show that in fact they go against their self-interest so often because in fact they have a moral psychology of conservatives have a different moral psychology from liberals. They really when they say, you know, what part of illegal don't you understand, you know, they really mean that. Because it's very important to them, the concept of rules, the concept of order, the concept of authority, the concept of government, you know, the concept of you get what you deserve, those sorts of things. You know, those are part of the moral value set that are much higher among conservatives than liberals on all issues. And so if you want to talk across these issues and understand people, and there are some different groups, advocacy groups that try to work with receiving communities, it's beginning to understand also the receiving side and understand the cost side as well as the benefit side, so you can try to sell the benefit side and ameliorate the cost side.
So what I would say is immigration legislation and reform really is the domain of the federal government, right? And in the latest U.S. Supreme Court opinion on immigration reform, and just about every opinion, even this conservative court affirms that immigration is really within the domain of the federal government, which is really why this fight is so intense at the federal level. But there's no such thing as a federal territory where immigrants live, right? They live in your communities. And there is also that level of state and municipal legislative, there is a level of there is the state level and the municipal level policy making that takes place that really shapes how communities respond and react to immigration. So I would say that and like I said earlier, there are immigrants living all over this country, and there are many immigrants living in this city. So covering this issue, I think, does require paying attention to what's going on at the federal level, because ultimately that is where the solution lies. But it also requires you to really take a look at how the state and how the cities and communities are responding to immigrants, whether, like Ed said, they're welcoming communities, or they are communities like those in a number of states that have decided to adopt a strategy of driving immigrants away.
You in your past life were the director of a community agency in New Haven, and before that worked in the mayor's office in New Haven. What do you see reporters as having typically missed about the ways that local governance and policy intersects with the lives of immigrants?
I don't see enough coverage that takes a look at immigrant communities and gets the perspective of immigrants themselves. I think there is a lot of coverage that is policy-based. There's a lot of coverage on immigration issues that look at the issue from the federal level or the state level. But I think a lot of the times what's missing are the voices of the people most affected, right? And if I were a reporter and I'm thinking about or covering a story that has to do with state or federal policy or even local level policy, I want to know how the people most affected respond to this. What do they think about it? How would it impact them? So I think a lot of the time, and one of the things that we've been pushing for at the Center for Community Change, is really lifting the voices of people most affected, because I think the stories really start there.
If you could address the language journalists use. It seems to have a very cyclical nature. As you noted, right now we're talking mostly in terms of economic impact. And to me, that seems to, in many ways, exacerbate mental health issues, because we're talking about people as labor units. And we have seen, certainly, you know, to go back to the keynote speaker, multi-generationally, to be thought of, to essentially see your place as having been accorded only in terms of filling the need for a labor within the United States, to the extent that, you know, like in the 30s, the repatriation, quote unquote, of Mexicans. You know, I mean, I think that there are real consequences for the language we use, and I'd be interested in hearing you talk about that.
That's by language, you're talking about undocumented immigrant versus illegal immigrant versus all that?
Even the choice to talk about economics as the guiding reason for not passing reform, that sort of thing.
Right. Well, I mean, we have, I think, the nation has to do what the nation thinks is best for the nation, right, first. Every nation does that, unless you want to decide that nations aren't important anymore. And so much of this fight is a universalist view of humankind versus a national view. And so the universalists are right and left, by the way. It's humanitarian left and the libertarian right are both universalists, right? And see people as people and don't see nation states and that type of a thing. So if you want to take the universal point of view, then clearly you put the immigrant first. If you want to, because you put the individual first and the nation's not important. If you want to say, there's a wonderful ethical debate out there among ethicists on this thing, and what's called the immigration paradox. And the immigration paradox is that if you have open borders, which is what both the humanitarian left and the libertarian right prefer, if you want to have open borders, those things that made the nation attractive become conceivably or theoretically become inundated, and they're no longer there, at least for the short term. In other words, the social welfare system you've built becomes so overwhelmed because so many immigrants pour in to take advantage of it that it ceases to exist. Or the economy you built ceases to exist because it becomes overwhelmed with cheap labor. Over time, the economists will all tell you, over time, it'll all build up and it'll compensate for itself, and we'll have, and this is the jungle capitalism argument, over time, we'll all be richer over time. The costs to get from here to there, however, are huge, and that's the immigration paradox, right? So finding the balance in there is the whole thing. That's the theoretical thing. In terms of the language issues that you raise, I mean, I think that's I do not begrudge Washington. You expect the Congress to be legislating on behalf of all Americans and not just on behalf of immigrant Americans. Because they still represent a nation. That said, the concern for immigrants clearly is crucial, and this because you want them to integrate. The real issue is, how do you integrate immigrants who are here today? And that's why I say we have to divide the undocumented here today from future flows, right? And so if you look at the ones here today, particularly those who've been here for a number of years, by now you got to decide, they're Americans, or they're part of our communities. And so if that's the case, how do you integrate them? What do you do the best for them? Because it's best for America. It's best for them, and it's best for the country. It's what do you do with Americans, because now they become Americans. Now, where do you draw the line? How long do you have to be here before you be called American, or we become concerned for you? This is aside from concern for refugees and a few people you bring in for the goodness of your heart. But go ahead.
Well, but let me just drill down with both of you on this, because I think the question of language is really important. I mean, the choices that journalists have made over the years have reflected very important changes in all kinds of issues. We go from battered women to domestic violence to intimate partner violence now, and these are very different choices. We go from AIDS to HIV to... I just was at a big international conference of news executives, and there was a UNESCO presentation on immigration-related issues, and UNESCO now is urging use of the term migrant rather than immigrant as a reflection of the economic and political reality, and because it's about the person rather than the legal status. If you could change one bit of language or one trope that journalism has in dealing with this issue, what would it be? Should we start saying undocumented Americans instead of undocumented immigrants? Or should we start, what should it be?
I think language matters. Look, I am a Black Puerto Rican woman, and I've been called many things, and I sometimes flinch when I see disenfranchised, disempowered populations in print being referred to in disparaging ways. I think it hits me, when I see Puerto Ricans referred to, or Black women referred to, or women referred to in disparaging ways. So to me, and this is really coming from my own personal experiences, language matters. I know there is a raging debate amongst newspapers about whether to use the word illegal, right? My preference is always to use undocumented Americans or undocumented immigrants. I think it's much more respectful. I suspect Ed is going to have a very different response to what I'm saying, although I don't want to put words in your mouth. There is a very thoughtful debate that journalists are having, particularly newspapers. There's an organization called Applied Research Center that has taken on this campaign called Drop the I Word, right? And different newspapers have taken very different positions about whether or not they're going to use the word illegal. And I have to say the arguments are thoughtful. I happen to think that people who use the word illegal are wrong, but that's just me. Ed.
I'm caught up in this just today because I'm not writing about that issue. I'm writing about the Washington Redskins and whether or not NPR should even use the word Redskin in talking about the team. Words take on meaning over time. There's a wonderful psychologist at Harvard named Steven Pinker, and he's written a whole book about the escalator of language, how words change meaning over time. And so sometimes Redskins, for example, is a good way to begin. Redskins is a word used originally by Native Americans because they painted themselves red. And so in all their discussions with the British in the early years of negotiating with the British in the first couple of centuries, they themselves referred to themselves as a self-identifier. The Redskins and the Whitefaces. They themselves called themselves Redskins. And it was actually an honorific to say Redskins. It was, I'm recognizing your word, which is critical, right? Now it's become a pejorative term, without a doubt. Without a doubt it's a pejorative term today. But as words change meanings over time, they all change. Any word changes meaning over time. And think of all the changing of words the African Americans have used. It's called the NAACP, means the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Their word, not ours, in terms of what they use for themselves, right? So it's the same thing with this undocumented illegal immigrant word.
Legal's never been positive, let's be.
Wait a minute, I was an illegal alien, don't tell me that. I was an alien, and I came here as an immigrant, and I always saw myself as an alien because that was the legal word. It did not bother me in the least. And I discovered I was undocumented years later. And I had to make the choice of either, leaving the country or raising my hand, and back then it was much easier. So words mean what they mean at different points in time. I mean, if you go down to the border, talk to any Mexican on the border, and they all use the words wetback, un mojado. It's the word they use themselves, amongst themselves, right? And the same thing with the issue of being illegal. They know they're breaking the law when they cross the border. I was the first reporter to cross I think I was, to be smuggled across the border back in the 70s for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Went down to Tijuana, hung out for a few weeks. After various attempts, and finally made it across. This is when all this was just starting, in the late 70s, and wrote about it. A huge series. Got nominated for Pulitzer, didn't win. Damn it. But nonetheless, all of them referred to themselves as illegales. All of them. Themselves, because they knew they were crossing the border illegally. There's no great secret to it, right? But as words become changed, as now it's become very pejorative to say illegal immigrant, I would recommend that you all use undocumented immigrant. I really would. Or unauthorized immigrant was what the policy guys like to say.
Is there any, and we're going to have to end here because we need to, but is there any other, in addition to this one highly emotive issue, right, illegal versus undocumented, and that's clearly a hot button one, is there any other language or any typical riff that one sees in news stories about immigration that could use some adjustment, that you think? Or we can also leave the room with that question. It's an interesting one.
I would have to think about that.
I like to say that the language is not what's important. On my classes, and I've taught on this issue for a few years, and written so much about it, and I do a lot of talking, and I always say, I don't want to get into this fight with anybody. As far as I'm concerned, everybody is coming at this with goodwill, and we're just going to, accept whatever language anybody uses. That's the way I enter it when I talk about it myself. For myself, I've finally come to the conclusion that illegal immigrant has become a pejorative word, like Redskins has become a pejorative. Not pejorative just yet, but it's reached a point that enough people feel offended by it, where they weren't before, that we got to move away from it. How do you make that judgment? It's a pure judgment call. It's a pure judgment call.
Well, I think that's as good a place as any to stop. Again, the conversation will continue because we're going to circulate Kica's and Ed's emails, and you should all be in touch with them. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we come back. We'll have Fernando Changmoy here, and we'll have a different kind of conversation. But thank you, Ed and Kica, very much.